Oktane.
Hi, this is I'm slightly intimidated.
Just 4,000 of our closest friends.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah.
People are excited. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I can't believe it. It's a lot more mellow behind the stage. Like, wow. That's cool.
So we're going to talk about a bunch of things. We're going to talk about your climbing and your career. We're going to talk about maybe how that translates to some of the things that folks in the audience think about and maybe struggle with in their lives and work. And we're going to talk about your philanthropy. So we'll try to hit all that in about 45 minutes. We'll see how we do.
Lead the way.
I want to start with humble beginnings. When you see what you do, it's hard to imagine that you ever started out and, we're in a position of not knowing how to do that. But how did this start? Where did you first fall in love with climbing, and take us back to that beginning moment?
I basically always loved climbing to some extent. As a little kid, I loved climbing on things, climbing trees, climbing play structures, climbing buildings, just anything. I liked being up high, I liked the position. And then when I was 10, a climbing gym opened in my hometown. I'm from Sacramento, California. And it was just lucky enough that a climbing gym opened a few miles away. And so my parents thought that it would be a safer outlet for my climbing impulses. Jokes on them, because I like to see where that led me. But yeah, so I started climbing when I was 10, and nobody in my family climbed. Nobody had any athletic background of any kind. My parents were both professors and language professors. But I got into climbing, and then I just started doing it all the time, and slowly got better at it.
And when did you transition? So it sounds like you started out in a climbing gym for the first however many years. How did that transition to being outside and doing it for real?
Yeah, so through my teen years, I would go outside occasionally whenever I had the opportunity. When other people from the climbing gym would take me out, and my family would camp and hike, not in any kind of extreme way, but at least enough time outdoors that I felt comfortable going outdoors and having adventures. And yeah, the thing is that the climbing culture, particularly back then, I started climbing in 1995, I guess. And nowadays, currently there was way more access to gyms and everything, and I assume that many of you have kids and things that have climbed indoors, and it's all pretty common now. But back then, climbing culture was much more focused around outdoor adventure and just sort of having these big outdoor experiences. And so I always felt like that's what real climbing was. And so even though I was growing up in the climbing gym, I aspired to do bigger things outside. Yeah. And so once I got a driver's license, I eventually dropped out. I went to UC Berkeley for a year and then dropped out to rock climb more. And so then I started really doing a lot more outdoors. Yeah.
And then how did that all translate into free soloing? And maybe you could tell folks who don't know what free soloing is.
Yeah, for those that didn't get it from the trailer, free soloing.
Maybe we all know at this point what it is.
Yeah, and actually you can see the photos. Free soloing is climbing without a rope. And actually, it's important to make the distinction that I'm probably most well known for free soloing, and certainly for the documentary Free Solo. But free soloing for me is it's oftentimes sort of a special occasion. It's like my Super Bowl or my World Cup or my World Series, whatever, my big moments of the year. And so most of the time I'm climbing with partners, I'm climbing with ropes, I'm training, I'm climbing in the gym, I'm doing whatever. I'm just kind of conventional day-to-day, bread and butter climbing. And then occasionally I'll take on bigger challenges like the things that you see in these photos as sort of tests or for whatever reason, but things that mean a lot to me I'll occasionally test myself on. But it's not as if I'm free soloing all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of people think what you do, and you see it, you see it in the film and the photos, a lot of people think that what you do is impossible. How do you think about it? Do you feel like things are impossible, and what drives you to take on things that others might consider impossible?
I mean, to be fair, some of the things seemed impossible to me for a long time as well.
Yeah.
It's certainly something like El Cap. I dreamed about free soloing El Cap for many years. And I guess I always sort of thought that it might be possible, but for maybe 7 years, I would look at it and be like, no, that's
what would you think when you looked at that? What was going through your head?
I would just think that is so scary. Actually, so I free soloed this other wall called Half Dome, which is a similar size wall. Actually, how many of you guys have been to Yosemite? Out of curiosity. Many? Oh yeah, cool. Okay, fair number. So, for those that have been, you know that Half Dome is this 2,000-foot wall that sits on the east end of Yosemite, and then El Cap is this 3,000-foot wall that sits at the west end of Yosemite. They're kind of the two biggest, most consequential walls, and they both hold very important places in climate history, sort of climate mythology. And so I free soloed halftime in 2008. And so starting in 2009, I was like, okay, I'll free solo okta next. Like that's the next obvious challenge. It was the same historical order. It's like that's the next thing. And so I drove into Yosemite the next season, like this is my year to free solo okta. And I looked at the wall and was like, there is no chance I'm free soloing okta. It's so scary. It's just too big. And so it's something that sat on the back burner for I guess 6 or 7 more years, where each year I'd be like, this is my year, and then I would drive in and look at it and be like, this is not my year. I just kind of kept slipping down into the bottom of the to-do list. And I did a lot of other things I was proud of and sought out a lot of other climbing challenges, and I slowly worked away at it, kind of. But, you know, I mean, it seemed impossible for a long time.
Yeah, and then what changed?
I don't know, there are a few things. I mean, I started to sort of accumulate other climate experiences and eventually got to the point where I was like, you know, I could kind of imagine this maybe happening. But then actually the biggest change, I think, was that I'd spent so many years hoping that I would drive in Yosemite and look at the wall and it would look easy somehow. I was hoping that I would get good enough at rock climbing that it would just seem easier. Because that did happen with some other walls there, but there were other things in my life that had seemed difficult or seemed impossible, and then as I improved as a climber, they suddenly seemed easy, and I was like, oh no, I can do that. And so I was kind of hoping that okta would just become easy someday.
Yeah.
But then after 6 or 7 years, I was like, this is never going to become easy. This just looks so hard. And I realized that it meant enough to me as a personal goal that I should put all the work in and do the prep and basically act as if I was going to do it, even though I didn't know if it was possible or not, and then sort of find out if it was possible.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. So when we told the team at Okta that you were going to be speaking here, there was a lot of excitement, and we discovered that there's a pretty incredible community of rock climbers at Okta who kind of came out of the woodwork. We actually have some photos, I think, of the group. Yeah, so meet our Okta rock climbing crew. And I know a bunch of them are here and a bunch of them are watching, so hey guys. Hope I do this conversation justice.
May I just say that 2 of these photos are within a half hour of here. 2 of these are home.
Oh, is it?
Las
Which
Vegas.
ones?
Yeah, that one is Red Rock, and then the one on the far right is Red Rock.
Awesome.
Like that's, I mean, I know that route.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, they're
So it's impressive, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I look at these, I'm like, this is serious stuff.
Yeah, this is
Great.
serious stuff.
It's great. Yeah, it's interesting that it seems like maybe there's a significant crossover community between folks who are in technology, maybe who are engineers or, you know, kind of work in our ecosystem and the climbing community. I wonder if you find that.
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, I was studying engineering until I realized that I had a greater aptitude for rock climbing than engineering, and certainly a greater passion for rock climbing than engineering. But no, there are a ton of climbers that are the right code for a living, things like that.
Yeah, and do you think that there's like common threads that tie those things together in terms of, I don't know.
I mean, I think that one of the things that many people find really engaging about rock climbing is the problem-solving component.
Yeah.
Like and that's one of the things that I love is looking at a wall that seems impossible and then breaking it into pieces and figuring out how to make it possible. And I think, and that even goes for climbing in the gym, is just the problem-solving component of how do you do this climb? Like, where do you put your hands and your feet? Which sequence do you use? You know, which order do you use? Like, and then trying things over and over and working on it until you eventually figure it out. And it's incredibly satisfying to spend quite a long time unlocking a puzzle and then solving it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to shift gears and talk about mindset. Many of us may never climb a mountain, although good on you if you do. But I think there's a tremendous amount of lessons that we can learn in terms of, you know, how you go about what you do. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about preparation first. So you don't just show up and scale the mountain, you prepare quite a bit. So take us through what your preparation looks like and, you know, mentally, physically.
Okay, I guess I'll start with the physical side, I guess, just because that's simpler in some ways. I mean, and I guess when we're talking about preparation, we'll talk about preparation for big free solos.
Sure.
So something like okta, just because it's kind of the stakes are highest and it's kind of the most obvious thing that you train for.
Yeah.
But so the physical preparation is relatively straightforward in that it's basically like preparing for any other sport. You know, if you're training for a marathon, you just put in your miles, you work on your pace, you build your muscles. And so as a climber, that kind of physical preparation is actually mostly what you just saw the Okta employees, all those photos. That's basically what I do as a day-to-day, like go climbing with a friend, with a rope. Those are all pictures of people roped in, just climbing conventionally. And so I do tons and tons of that to physically get in shape for the things like this that you're seeing. Though actually, even that photo in the middle, we're rappelling off of a route that we found in China. But that's a rope climb. We spent a couple weeks working on something that was really difficult for us. It whipped us into good physical shape. You're kind of like, it's a straightforward, safe way to prepare for free soloing.
Yep.
So the physical side, relatively straightforward. Not saying that it's easy, because obviously it's still hard work to train all the time and to eat well and sleep enough and all those kinds of things. It's not necessarily easy to do, but at least it's straightforward and it's known how to train for things. The mental side is a little bit more nebulous. I mean, particularly when you're preparing for some of these free solos, like things that haven't been done before, you don't necessarily know what the best way to prepare for it is. So part of that is I spend a lot of time visualizing, basically just imagining how to do something, like sort of pretending to climb it in your mind over and over, and not just visualizing the experience, or really visualizing every aspect of the experience. Like, how will it feel to put your foot on certain footholds, and how will it feel to look down and see 2,500 feet of air while you're doing the hard parts?
Do you look down?
Well, you have to. I mean, so that's a common question. People are like, oh, do you look down? And you're like, well, yeah, obviously, because you move your feet every move. Like, all of rock climbing is driven by your feet. You're constantly moving your feet up and placing your feet very intentionally on very small footholds. So you're constantly looking at your footholds. So you literally spend most of your time looking down.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm up there for a reason, because I think it's freaking awesome. So, it's like, yeah, I want to look around, I want to enjoy the view, I want to take in the experience. And even on something sort of cutting edge, like even something really difficult for me, like El Cap, still has easy sections where you can look around, you can see the birds, you can enjoy the view.
Yeah.
You're in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Like you do enjoy the position for sure, even when you're doing things that are really difficult.
So when you're standing there, what are you thinking?
Well, in that particular moment, I'm
Yes.
like, holy shit. but in the in the time getting into that position, in the time getting out of that position, in the hours climbing up to there, you have a lot of moments where you're like, this is amazing, this is incredible. In that particular moment, though, you're like, oh my geez, this is really scary. But that actually, I mean, funny backstory with that photo. I don't know, I mean, it's a long story, it doesn't totally matter, but that came from free soloing Half Dome. And I did that totally by myself, and then a year later, a camera crew came to record a film with me on it, and it wound up being a film for the Banff film tour. And many free solos, basically everything except for my free solo of El Cap has been done like that, where I do it by myself, and then at some point later come back with a photographer, film the parts that are easy enough for me, things that you can do again safely, or whatever. El Cap was different in that it was a real documentary film where we just documented the whole process, and so what you see is the actual event. But many of the other solos were just, I just posed the easy parts again when it made sense. Because that's how a lot of climbing is done. You just do a climb when you can, and then you shoot it whenever you can safely. But so, this thing with Half Dome, so that ledge is called Thank God Ledge. It's like a little narrow sliver, and it's called Thank God because the first ascensionists were going straight out towards this giant overhanging roof feature above them, and they were like, we are screwed. And then they suddenly got to this miraculous ledge where they were able to scoot off to the side and then escape from underneath this big, imposing overhang. So it's Thank God Ledge. And climbing the wall with a rope, I've climbed that. I've walked across it face in, I've walked across it face out, I've hand traversed. Most people kind of crawl across it and kind of hug it, and it's very undignified. But it's like, and so I remember that I'd walked across it, I just couldn't remember if I'd walked it face in or face out or whatever when I'd soloed it. And so we went up there filming, and I was like, oh yeah, I can walk across it, no problem. And it turns out walking across it face out without a rope, really freaking scary. and I just didn't quite remember. And so I shuffled out, we got into the position, and I was like, oh my god, this is really scary. And then had this whole moment of panic where I was like, you know what, I don't think this is the way I free soloed it. It's like abort, and then I had to kind of shuffle back to where it starts wide enough, like kind of the width of this table maybe, and then it narrows down. And when it narrows down, your feet are hanging off your toes are hanging off the edge, and your back is kind of arched. And so I basically got into that part, and I was like, oh no, bad decision, and then crept back. Anyway, yeah.
It makes me feel so good when you say it's really scary. So when you get to a point where you're like, bad decision, now what? What do you do in those moments?
Well, in that case, I took a big deep breath, I composed myself, I kind of tried not to panic, and then I kind of shuffled back into a wider area where I could turn around and then, basically do the undignified crawl and sort of save myself. But it totally depends. If you get really scared, you really just have to do what everybody does, which is take a deep breath, compose yourself, try to stay collected, and then carry on.
Yeah.
I will say that I think, though, as a professional professional climber or just as a serious rock climber, you just find yourself in so many scary situations that you wind up getting a lot of practice with dealing with fear, because you just get scared a lot, and so you have to manage.
Yeah. Is it hard for you to maintain you're so focused, you're so disciplined, obviously, but is it hard for you at times to maintain that, or how do you maintain that?
You mean on a climb or in life?
I would say life, either.
Well, life is tough because you're constantly like, oh, should I be more serious about my diet? Should I be training harder? I mean, especially as sort of a self-trained athlete, you're constantly like, should I be doing more? Should I be doing less? Should I be resting more? Should I be trying harder? You know, I mean, that type of motivation is can be hard to maintain, especially over years. I mean, I've been climbing full-time my entire life. I'm 39 now, and I started when I was 10, so it's like 29 years of basically climbing nonstop, and always thinking about like, how can I do this better? Like, how can I go harder? Like, can I go harder? And so, I mean, that's tiring for sure.
Yeah.
But you do your best. You know, every once in a while you have periods of low motivation, and you just go with it. It's playing the long game.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this, but like, tell us more about how you work through problems in real time. I think there's a lot of really interesting lessons in that for this group when we think about some of the challenges technology teams are facing around cybersecurity risk and threats, and maintaining security of their organizations, and just a lot coming at them in real time. So how are you solving your problems as they come?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I would say that actually I try to solve most of my problems not in real time by preparing ahead of time and making sure that I don't have problems. Which I suspect is
similar,
probably,
very similar.
I suspect that for security you try to do the same thing as well, where like avoid problems or like, but I guess that once something unforeseen happens, or once I'm suddenly in a position that's really scary, then I think all I can do is just try to stay calm and do the next best thing. Like, what is the correct action in that moment? Like, don't panic, just deep breath and collect yourself and do what you can moving forward.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I sort of hope though that cybersecurity folks have a better way to deal with this. I mean, a lot of these climbing tools, you just kind of do what feels right, because a lot of this is physiological, like within your own body. Like when you get really scared, your vision contracts, your pulse quickens. Like a lot of things happen in your body, and you feel that, and then you sort of respond to those feelings in certain ways. I sort of hope that cybersecurity is a little bit less like, oh, I feel sick to my stomach, and so I'm just I'm not sure.
It's interesting when we do exercises and simulations around sort of cyber risk and things. We've brought in this notion of breathing into sort of how we practice doing that, and it's very similar. It's just like you do have to slow down because your heart starts racing. It's all the same stuff, right? It's fear, it's threat, it's immediate, it's reaction, and you have to try and
I sort of hope that there's less visceral fear though in cybersecurity, but like, is there? Are you actually just sweating, being like, oh my god, I'm gonna die? It's like, is that?
I'm looking at the team. We'll see what they say.
Yeah, it's like.
Okay, so there's this really cool concept that you talk about called elective hardship. Can you talk about that for the group? What is that? How do you use that concept in your life and in your climbing?
I mean, that's not totally my idea, but that comes a little more from my friend Tommy Caldwell, who's also a professional climber, who I've done a lot of big adventures with. But I guess the idea is that, we all lead easy lives. I mean, basically anybody here is leading a relatively easy life in the grand scheme of global, basically, like, if you're sitting here, your scene is pretty chill. It's like climate controlled, there's nice lighting, we're relaxed, it's easy. And so, you kind of have to choose to do hard things in order to broaden yourself as a person. And so much of climbing is choosing challenges for yourself, like choosing things that you find meaningful that will push you in new ways that you can learn from. And so the idea of elective hardship is just choosing to do hard things.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so there is a moment in free solo where you're soloing El Cap and you decide, I'm not going to continue. Do you look at that as a failure or as a problem to be fixed, or do you look at that as like part of the process to get you there?
Yeah, out of curiosity, how many of you guys have seen free solo? Fair number? Yeah, okay, not all of you, but so those that haven't, you don't need to, because here I am. You know the ending. It's like, it doesn't freaking matter. Yeah, like that movie, what a waste of time. He makes it. So for those that haven't seen it, there's an attempt where I start to free solo cap, and several hundred feet off the ground, I basically get scared and choose to cheat through a certain section. I pull on some of the fixed hardware that's on the wall, which is cheating, so it no longer counts as free soloing. And I still actually wound up having to go up quite a long ways, and then I descend some ropes. But anyway, I wind up not doing it, and I bail off the wall. And at the time, it definitely felt like a big, fat failure. It was very embarrassing.
Yeah.
As the whole film crew's in position, everybody's ready, everyone's like, okay, you're doing the thing, and then I went up there and I didn't do the thing. I was like, oh, that's so embarrassing, that's so unfortunate. But then with a little bit more perspective, I was kind of like, this is all part of the process, like this is fine. Yeah. Because as it was still a big milestone for me to even walk to the base El Cap with no rope and no harness and no gear and start climbing it. Because it's pretty freaking intimidating just to get off the ground with nothing on and then climb the first 1,000 feet. And so I was like, yeah, technically I cheated on a few parts and then I came down after 1,000 feet. But doing an unroped excursion up El Cap was still a huge mental breakthrough and a huge milestone for me. And I went home that winter, I trained the whole season, I came back in the springtime, and I was much better prepared, I had a better sense of what to do, and then I successfully did the climb and felt great. And so then, with a little bit more retrospect, I'm like, well, obviously that's part of the process.
Yeah.
Like, you just have to, even though it felt like a terrible failure in that moment, I'm like, that's fine, it's all part of it. Yeah. But that's actually the interesting thing in climbing in general, is that it's never really a failure unless you give up on something. Because with climbing, it's not like other sports where there's like a game, you either win or you lose. It's like if you're attempting to do some kind of climb, every time you fail on that climb is all just part of the process until you eventually succeed, or unless you eventually give up on it entirely and decide not to do it anymore, and then you have failed. But there are many things that, many projects that I've had for literally years, and then, if you ever succeed on them eventually, then you're like, great, I succeeded.
It all makes sense now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of people see the movie and see what you do free solo. The name implies it's you doing it. But it's actually quite a bit of teamwork behind the scenes and collaboration to get you there, and climbing in general. So talk to us about the role of teamwork in what you do.
Yeah, in general, in climbing, it's you and your partner roped together, and your life depends upon you trusting your partner. And so, I would say there's always a pretty serious element of teamwork in rock climbing. And then even for something like the film Free Solo, which is all focused on me free soloing this route, but we filmed together for 2 years, and the climb took me a little bit under 4 hours when I ultimately did it. These are more big spoilers for those that haven't seen the film. But so, I eventually do the climb, it takes me 4 hours. I'm like, man, I spent 2 years with this group of people training, working on it, rappelling the wall, doing all these other things, and that was all with the team. And so, 2 years of effort with the team for a 4-hour performance at the end, on balance, is still almost entirely a team sport.
Yeah. Great. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about your philanthropy work. So you have been quoted as saying that from the minute I earned more money than I needed to live, I started to give it away.
Did I say that?
Okay, yes. I saw you say it.
Okay.
It was in your Nat Geo show.
Okay.
Which is great, by the way. It's called Alpine Ascent, and we'll talk about it in a second.
Okay.
I highly recommend it.
Okay.
Anyway, you did say that, and I think it's good for you.
No, it is true.
But tell us about that. That's a pretty, this was for many, many years now. You've been sort of living this value. Where does that come from, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, so that came from, I was living in my van, I was climbing full time, I was doing exactly what I wanted to do, I was leading my best life, I was challenging myself in all the ways that I wanted, I felt very fulfilled in the challenges that I was seeking out, everything I was working on, and I was sponsored by climbing companies. Basically, I was just suddenly making more than I needed. Particularly your overhead is very low when you're living in a van and just traveling and climbing full time. And I just felt like I should be doing something useful in the world, and so I started donating roughly a third of my income, and I'm still donating roughly a third of my income every year through the Honnold Foundation to support solar projects around the world. But at the time, I was just sort of open to any kind of environmental projects that improve standard of living. I was like, I want to do something useful. I want to make sure that it helps human populations and that it helps the environment. And the projects that I wound up funding were often solar projects in different places, like energy access projects. They help communities, but also helped with clean energy. And so over the years, we've now explicitly focused on solar projects. But when I started it, I was just like, I feel like I should be doing something useful.
Yeah, and how did how did the environmental aspect kind of come into play for you?
Well, the environmental side is a pretty natural tie into climbing because I spent so much of my time outdoors and so much of my time in the most remote, beautiful places in the world. I've been on a lot of expeditions. I've put up new routes on all 7 continents, so I've traveled widely, seen remote human communities everywhere. I've read quite a bit about the environment and sort of about global energy issues, global poverty, things like that. When I started the Honnold Foundation, there were stats that there was something like 1 billion people on Earth without access to energy. And I've been on several different expeditions to different parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world where just like, you can drive for literally days across nothingness with no roads. Like I drove to the northeastern corner of Chad, which is like the middle of nowhere with no roads. And there are people living out there, people herding their animals and just kind of eking out a meager existence. And you're like, these are people who have no access to power and realistically will never have access to power in their lifetime. There's never going to be grid-tied power. Like if they ever have access to power, it's coming from solar because there's just no economic reason that there's not even going to be fossil fuel infrastructure there ever because it's so many days of travel from the closest. It's so remote. And there's so many places in the world like that. I don't know, I had this common expedition like in this corner of Chad. We'd spend the whole day climbing and these kids would come and watch. And which I'm sure for them, they were like, this is the craziest thing they've ever seen. Like, these random freaking white dudes drove all the way across the middle of nowhere to come climb these crumbling sandstone towers. They were all like, these guys are idiots. It's like, the rock, as it turned out, the pictures are incredible and the spires look really cool, but the rock quality was horrendous. And which, of course, you don't know until you go and you try. But so we're there having these total, this is elective hardship. Like, we're having these total survival experiences trying to climb these crumbling sandstone towers. And these little kids are herding their goats, watching us, being like, "What a bunch of psychos!" This is crazy. But looking at all these kids, I was always struck by like any one of these kids, could be an astronaut, could be whatever. Like they all have the same human potential of anybody else, but they have none of the opportunity because they're growing up in the middle of freaking nowhere and they're just going to be herding goats their whole life. And I saw that as just such a waste of human potential to some extent. So like you just never know which of these kids is like some incredible genius and just won't have that opportunity. And so that's why I kind of saw energy access as this base human. It's like the first step in human development.
Yeah. And what is bringing solar energy to a indigenous local community do? What are some of the outcomes that you guys have seen?
Well, the things that I've seen personally the most are just when communities get light for the first time. In like equatorial parts of the world, communities are in darkness for 12 hours a day, because like if you're around the equator, it's dark 12 hours a day, every day, all year. And so if you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no one in the village has access to power, it's literally just dark for 12 hours a day. Like think how much less productive time you have. It's like as soon as the sun sets, village life ceases, everybody just hangs out and chit-chats a bit and then goes to bed.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy. Like people can't read after dark, people can't, cook, people can't do things. And so I've been on a few expeditions, and the Honnold Foundation has certainly supported a bunch of projects over the years that are just basic, providing solar panel, small battery, and LED lights. And it's crazy in some of these villages, like you put in a light for the first time, and suddenly that hut becomes the center of village life, because it's like the one place that's lit after dark. You're like, man, it has a transformative impact on communities. But then, light is kind of I think the bare minimum, like the first step for energy access. Beyond that, people use refrigeration. And then you get into all the things that everybody wants power for. They charge their cell phones, they, ideally charge radios, they charge small devices, charge batteries to use other things with power. The Honnold Foundation actually, and Okta for Good, has been supporting a project in the Amazon with solar-powered boats.
I think we have some pictures of that actually.
Oh yeah. But basically, like once you have access to energy, you can do so much more. But I think that starts with light and then powering small devices and eventually refrigeration and food processing and things like that.
Yeah, we've been so honored to partner with you guys. We've actually, Okta for Good and the Honnold Foundation have partnered on about 5 projects around the world now. And you see some pictures from some of the projects here.
Yeah, there's the boat behind us.
Talk more about that project, would you? I just think it's
cool.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, so that's an organization called Car Solar that the Honnold Foundation is one of the early supporters for. And actually, I think one of the interesting things about the solar-powered boat project is that it shows the sort of knock-on benefits that can come from a project like this. And so in the Amazon, remote communities, like basically the further you get upstream, the more expensive fuel cost is because you have to transport diesel that far. And so it gets more and more expensive to do things further up the river. And so when it gets expensive enough, then it makes sense to cut a road, because it's just a way for a community to have access to the rest of the world, even though traditionally people have only navigated by boat. And I've experienced this myself personally on a few climbing expeditions, going like into Puys in remote Guyana. It's like you basically take boats as far as you can up the river and then bushwhack through the jungle for the rest of the way to the cliff. And so in these communities, you know, if it's too expensive to transport on the river, then they're open to the idea of cutting a road to a community. But as soon as you cut a road, then the whole area is open to illegal logging, illegal mining, like basically exploitation in various ways, because it's too hard to protect an area like that if the road's cut. And so by doing something like solar powered boats, by basically lowering the cost of transportation on the rivers, then it makes it viable for communities to not cut roads and therefore protect huge swaths of forest. And those are the kinds of added benefits you can see from some of these energy access projects. We're like, oh, when communities are able, and this is all community led. I mean, these are indigenous people choosing the solutions that they think are best.
I think this is actually a really important point to make, which is the way that you go about doing this is very different than a lot of foundations. You don't come in unless you're invited, right?
Yeah.
The communities decide what they need, what purpose it needs to serve, and come to you and say, this is what we want to do. And then you even told me earlier, you said, I asked Alex, I said, do you ever go and visit these projects that Honnold Foundation funds? And you said, I don't go unless I'm invited. And, you know, it's really, I would say the power dynamic sometimes in philanthropy is pretty off when it comes to who gives and who receives. And I think it's beautiful the way that you guys have really flipped that around. It's one of the things we love most about partnering with you.
I mean, honestly, you know, I don't even really know what traditional philanthropy is or how
well, good for you.
Do it. It's like, I mean, to some extent,
make it better.
You know, I've always felt like I want to do something useful. Here are people who have, you know, each one of these projects represents a community choosing the way that they think they can best improve the quality of their own lives, and all they're lacking is money. I'm kind of like, well, that's an easy solution. Wire them some money, and then they can implement the projects they want. They can improve their lives in whatever way is most beneficial to them, and that's great. And yeah, I mean, some of these projects, like actually Car Solar, I was in Ecuador for a friend's destination wedding, which I think is totally stupid. And actually after going, I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. I was like, it's not worth the amount of travel. I mean, because so much of it to me is the environmental footprint and just like the carbon cost, this kind of stuff. But anyway, because I was in Ecuador, I did visit the folks that run Car Solar to see some examples of their boats, and just like I met with them in Quito. And, actually, they met me at the climbing gym, and we got to do a little climbing session and kind of see the boats and see how the mechanism all works. Because I'm like, yeah, if I'm there, I mean, I find the work super inspiring, and I love to see what people are working on. I just don't want to feel like a burden by showing up, being like, show me what you're doing. You know, I'm kind of like, I trust. I mean, it's a lot like climbing in that you just work with people that you trust, and then you really trust them. And so, you know, you fund their work, and you let them do what they need to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we have something kind of fun to share, and I don't know if you know this yet. Maybe this is a surprise for you. Hopefully you're all inspired by the work that Alex and his foundation are doing, and we've decided that in lieu of giving you guys swag, which I know you love, but hopefully it's okay that you didn't get a backpack or a mug. In lieu of that, we're actually making a donation on behalf of everybody in the room to the Honnold Foundation. So a couple last questions for you. First one is just what's next? You are doing so many things. You have done so many things. Like what's top of mind? What's coming up for you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to Yosemite soon with the family. I now have two small daughters. I have an 8-month-old and a 2.5-year-old. And so, you know, climbing for me looks slightly different than it did a couple years ago. Fewer big expeditions, maybe just basically trying to focus on more things close to home. I'm actually climbing as well as ever, but just focusing on things that are nearby, so I can drop my daughter off at daycare and then go to the cliff for a few hours and then pick her up on the way home. Slightly different kinds of projects. But I don't know. I mean, I guess you guys are maybe screening a film. Last summer I went on a big expedition. A friend and I, Tommy Caldo, who I mentioned earlier, the two of us bicycled from his house in Colorado to Alaska, and we climbed a bunch of walls along the way, but that's a film coming out on National Geographic, I think on Thursday. It's like, yeah, coming out this week, and I think Okta is getting to do a pre-screening or something?
Yes, we have a sneak preview of this new documentary that's coming out Thursday night. We're actually, surprised, we're screening it here at noon on Thursday over lunch, so you guys can check it out if you want to.
honestly, I have no idea how that happened, and I'm a little surprised by
I
it.
don't
I'm like,
either.
I don't think
Thank you,
Disney
team.
Plus. Yeah, it's like Disney Plus is pretty stingy about like giving out pre-release stuff. And you're like, all right, that's cool.
We'll take it.
But no, but it's a fun film. It's a good adventure. It's like an hour and 15 minutes of us bicycling from Colorado to Alaska and climbing a bunch of things along the way. And it's a pretty cool adventure. So there's the possibility of some other projects like that next year, but it's just hard to know with TV stuff what will actually happen.
Do you take your girls out climbing? Well, probably not the 8-month-olds, but
Actually,
toddler?
even the
Even the
8-month-old, the 8-month-old one went out climbing with my wife a couple days ago, and she took the
How does
cutest
that
photo of
work?
her at the cliff. It was so darling. But she just sits there underneath the rocks, but you know, she's getting there.
okay.
But, no, and actually, the 2.5-year-old I have started taking to the rocks. She has a little helmet, a little harness, and then I use like a very short little piece of rope, and I kind of drag her. It's almost like a dog leash, but it's safer. It's cuter than it sounds. She scrambles around and climbs on rocks. It's totally darling.
Love it. All right, last question for you. You've got a room full of, again, tech professionals. All of us have our own life goals and career goals, and maybe some of them might seem impossible at times. What advice do you have for the folks in the room?
I don't know. I mean, you guys are all much smarter than I am. I would just say that with impossible goals, it's like, is it really impossible? I mean,
Yeah.
I think differentiating between things that are impossible and things that are really hard is kind of important, because something that's really hard, you're like, well, okay, sure, it's really hard, but it's, you know, why is it hard? In which ways is it hard? You break it down into the pieces, you work on the things that need to be worked on. And then eventually you're kind of like, is it actually that hard? You know, once you break it down enough and you figure out the different things, you're like, oh no, it's pretty doable. I don't know, I mean, there are very few things that are actually impossible, but there are tons of things that are just very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, if you're willing to put the work in and try the difficult things, you know, I think you'll find that a lot of them are not actually that difficult when you get down to it. Or maybe they are difficult, but with enough time and effort, you can still get it done. And I think that's...
Well said.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alex.